Welcome to another episode of Foreword, the podcast series brought to you by ISS ESG, the responsible investment arm of Institutional Shareholder Services. I'm Mara Souders, your host and communications lead at ISS ESG. Today I'm joined by three of my colleagues who will explore the palm oil industry, its various social and environmental risks, as well as how investors can respond to these risks. Joining me today are Nithya Iyer, responsible investment consultant and researcher for ISS ESG, Dominika Dobielewska, and Dennis Tong, both of whom are ESG analysts at ISS ESG. Thank you all for joining me for this episode. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nithya, who can introduce in more detail the topic of palm oil.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nithya Iyer, and I am an RI consultant and researcher at ISS ESG Australia, with experience in ESG policy, research and analysis across issues in the Asia-Pacific region.
Hello, my name is Dominika Dobielewska. I am an ESG research analyst at the Sectorbased screening at ISS ESG in Stockholm.
Hi, I'm Dennis Tong, and I'm also an ESG research analyst in the Screenings and Controversies team at ISS ESG.
Today's podcast aims to dive a little deeper into the topic of palm oil, the range of ESG risks that have manifested from this industry, and to discuss how investors can respond to these risks within their portfolios. So I'll begin with a brief overview. Palm oil plantations currently cover more than 27 million hectares of the Earth's surface, an area roughly the size of New Zealand. The palm oil industry has experienced a threefold increase of production over the last 2 decades, and palm oil and its derivative ingredients are now identifiable in a third of all vegetable oils produced globally, ranging from biodiesel to makeup to chocolate spread. Palm oil now represents a $37.3 billion industry that produces 55 million metric tons annually. This production does, of course, have a significant ecological and social impact, as we will explore today. So it's of little surprise that it has attracted so much consumer and investor attention. As International Day for Biological Diversity approaches on the 22nd of May, it is timely to revisit the responsible investment concerns in palm oil and to refresh investor momentum on addressing some of these risks. Dominika, could you start us off by providing some more background on the industry? What are the characteristics of its supply chain, and where is palm oil produced and consumed?
Sure. In fact, the palm oil supply chain can get a little bit complex. It can sometimes be difficult to trace the different players, as they tend to get mixed up together in different stages of the production cycle. But in general, palm oil can be found basically at every stage of the supply chain, starting with agricultural production in the upstream, where all palms are grown in plantations, down to the midstream in refineries, where the fresh fruit bunches are processed into more usable ingredients by companies, to the transport, trade, and distribution between the different actors in the industry, all the way down to the manufacturing of finished products, retail, and consumption. Now, you asked about the regions concerned, and this is interesting for palm oil because the production of palm oil is very much concentrated in Southeast Asia. We are most notably talking about Indonesia and Malaysia here. This is where most of the plantations currently are. It has been estimated that about 85% of all palm oil that is produced in the world comes just from Indonesia and Malaysia. That means that a lot of controversies linked to the production of palm oil will be linked to just this region. And when it comes to consumption, in general, it is pretty much global at this point, although it is higher in the Eastern Hemisphere. So the producing countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, but also countries such as China and India, are quite large consumers of palm oil. The US and the EU markets also have their share over there. They would account for about 10-15% of global consumption. And most of this is used in foods. About 70% of palm oil would go to the food manufacturing. And this is followed by consumer goods such as cosmetics and detergents, but also energy production. Some amount of palm oil production would go there.
Thank you, Dominika. So just to establish up front, why is it that palm oil is so persistently popular compared to other vegetable oils?
Palm oil is popular because it is a very efficient plant. Palm fruits produce approximately 10 times as much oil as any other oil crops, and it is also very land efficient. Palm oil makes up about 35% of all vegetable oils, but it is grown on just 10% of the land allocated to them. And that makes it cheap. And, producers really like cheap ingredients, so they're going to use it. But also there are some other characteristics, apart from its cheap price, that make it popular. Palm oil has a long shelf life. It is solid at room temperature. It holds color quite well, has almost no taste. All this make it a very good ingredient for a lot of different applications. And the result of it is that palm oil is basically in almost everything that we have nowadays, from, packaged bread or biscuits that you may eat in the morning to the lipstick or soap that we all use so much nowadays, to ice cream, to biofuels, in a lot of different things, really.
Okay, so yes, it certainly does sound like a dream oil. And we've heard a lot about its benefits now, but of course, we also know about the many negative aspects of the industry. Dennis, could you speak a little bit about the environmental risks that are associated with palm oil?
Yeah, sure. So deforestation is really the main environmental risk associated with palm oil industry. As Dominica said, the demand for oil is extremely high. And so to meet that demand, producers are always trying to produce more. Well, to do that, the oil palm is a tropical palm tree. And so it grows best in location where tropical rainforests tend to naturally be. And so when producers are trying to make more, they have been known to cut down those forests to plant monocultures of oil palm. For example, on the island of Borneo in Indonesia, at least 50% of all deforestation between 2005 and 2015 was related to palm oil development. This leads to another of the major problems with palm oil and our topic for today, biodiversity loss. So as we also said before, about 85% of the cultivation occurs in Indonesia and Malaysia, two countries that are widely known for being rich in biodiversity in plants and animals. Deforestation threatens the habitats of the plants and animals on those islands, including the orangutan, the Bornean elephant, and the Sumatran tiger. These animals are fairly popular and capture a lot of the public's attention, but it also impacts a slew of other beings in the forest, including insects, reptiles, birds, and wild plants. It's really deforestation and biodiversity loss being the main environmental issues associated with palm oil.
Yes, I think a lot of people would have seen the boycott advertisements with the orangutans and the animals on it. I'm also aware that there are quite a lot of social risks and labor risks concerned with the industry. Is there something that you can tell us about those social concerns?
Yeah, a little briefly on the social side, human rights is a major issue associated with the palm oil industry, mainly in the displacement of indigenous peoples in those rainforests. So companies, when they are clearing the land, they don't go through the right processes of consulting with the people that originally lived there, the process of free, prior, and informed consent. And so that can be a pretty major violation of international standards and is a major risk to the industry. The other one is labor rights. There have been stories of unsafe working conditions, unpaid overtime, unpaid wages, discrimination, and in some cases, child labor at palm oil plantations in Southeast Asia and then also in other countries where palm oil is produced.
So that's quite a list of ESG impacts that we're hearing. Could you just speak a little bit about the way that these risks would impact on company value?
So companies can certainly face market, operational, and reputational risks from involvement in palm oil. Stakeholders like customers, NGOs, and investors have pressured companies throughout the supply chain on their involvement in the industry and its connection to deforestation. For example, many consumer packaged goods companies have been targeted by the public for allegedly selling products with deforestation-tainted palm oil, and NGOs like Greenpeace have run campaigns linking palm oil sourcing to orangutan deaths. According to one study, reputational events can impact a company's value by up to 30%, which is fairly significant.
Yes, it is quite significant. I'm wondering if that impact on value plays out in an investor portfolio in other ways. How do you see it occurring from your experience?
For investors, the food and agriculture industry is fairly attractive in that population is growing. Some estimates put the projected world population to be 10 billion by 2050. And so that just means more and more mouths to feed. And so, the industry will be growing. But as we said before, there's a lot of risks in the sector as a whole that can materially affect company performance and therefore affect investor returns. So investors will have to consider portfolio exposure to the sector and, if possible, specifically to palm oil.
Certainly. Dominica, could you tell us a little bit more about the company level initiatives that aim to make palm oil more sustainable?
Yes, of course. Fortunately, there are such commitments. There is some part of companies that do publish general commitments to producing or sourcing palm oil in a more environmentally and socially responsible manner. So we definitely can see that. And what we do like to see is when they actually explicitly commit to the industry's best practice, which is the so-called NDPE, which refers to no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation. And in such commitments, companies usually commit to not develop on high conservation value areas, on carbon stock forests, not develop on peatlands, regardless of depth. They commit to no burning, respecting the rights of all workers, including indigenous peoples, resolving all grievances, just to name a few of these aspects that relate to what Dennis has been just talking about, all those environmental and social aspects. NDPE is a best practice, not a norm, however. Just to give you an example, from our research, we have seen that for 100 issuers involved in plantations or refining operations that derive more than 25% of revenue from palm oil, about 70 published the palm oil policies, which is not so bad, but only 17 committed to the best practice, to the NDPE statement. And when it comes to companies in the downstream segment, so for example, manufacturers of food or personal care products, from the companies that had significant revenues, so more than 10%, we have seen that about 70% of them have some sort of palm oil policy, but only 30% had an NDPE commitment. And what companies can also do, which is getting more popularity nowadays, fortunately, is to join the main standard-setting multi-stakeholder initiative, which is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, or the RSPO. The RSPO has been launched in 2004 with the backing of WWF, when we have seen that the palm oil industry is responsible for quite considerable devastation. The RSPO has today about more than 4,000 members across the different sectors of the palm oil industry. And that includes producers, so plantations, but also processors or traders, consumer goods manufacturers, retailers, but also the financial sector, banks and investors, as well as NGOs and other actors. The general idea behind the RSPO, its theory of change, is to make sustainable palm oil the norm, basically. And in order to do it, the RSPO has developed global standards for responsible palm oil, and companies can get RSPO certification. I'm not going to go too deep into the certification structure because that would take a lot of time. The general idea, however, is that companies gradually increase their transparency, and in the end, they should be able to say that 100% of their palm oil comes from an identifiable certified source. And the way of tracking this for the RSPO is basically to have the members report their progress in annual reports every year to the RSPO.
Thank you, Dominica. I have heard previously of the RSPO, and I know that it has also had a lot of concerns raised in regards to the legitimacy and the governance of the RSPO in recent years. What are some of the concerns around the RSPO that investors should be aware of? Dennis, perhaps you can speak to this.
Yeah, there are definitely some shortcomings with the RSPO. I think first and foremost is its coverage. It only covers about 19% of palm oil on the market. And so while there are a few other sustainability certifications for palm oil, 19% is the highest. And so the majority of palm oil on the market is just not certified. From our data, we could say that of the issuers flagged for palm oil, about 20% have half of their product certified by the RSPO, and only about 10% disclose that they are fully certified by the RSPO. So just demonstrating from our data that that the coverage of RSPO isn't so broad. Another problem with the RSPO is its enforcement. As Dominica mentioned, it has these standards called the principles and criteria, which are trying to make the industry more sustainable. But to enforce those standards, they require auditors to assess the companies and their compliance. But there have been stories and allegations that the auditors have been bribed or compromised in some way by the companies to give them better scores. So it is a major question of the RSPO's legitimacy. And then another issue is that its complaints process through which the RSPO assesses violations of the principles and criteria is notoriously slow, with one case that has been ongoing for 9.5 years. That being said, even though it has its issues, the RSPO is the most developed and the most promising system we have for making the industry more sustainable.
Sure. Dennis, could you give us a case study to illustrate how some of these risks can play out on a company level? both in terms of the ESG risks and its relationship to the RSPO?
Definitely. For those of you who are familiar with the palm oil industry, this story may be familiar. A couple of years ago, there was a company, a producer slash grower based out of Indonesia that was accused of illegal land clearing and development on peat in Indonesia by an international NGO. Those allegations eventually made their way to the RSPO complaints panel, which investigated the claims and subsequently verified that those claims were true. And based on that decision, the RSPO suspended the company's membership, causing 27 buyers to stop purchasing from that company. And these were pretty major buyers, widely known consumer packaged goods companies. And so that's significant business loss to that producer group. And as a result, their share price dropped immediately afterwards. A little bit after this happened, the company submitted a remediation plan with the RSPO and started to implement some of those improvements. And the RSPO eventually unsuspended their membership so that those companies could, if they wanted to, begin purchasing from that company again. And so while it's hard to say now if the company has fully recovered financially or reputationally, it is an example of how the RSPO process can be successful in a way, and also about just how those ESG risks can really impact a company's bottom line.
Thank you, Dennis. Aside from the RSPO, are there any national standards that we have around sustainable palm oil, or do we only rely on voluntary commitments? Dominica, perhaps you can speak to this.
Yes, of course. Of course, there are some mandatory national standards. Most notably, we would talk about Indonesian and Malaysian standards. So Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil, ISPO, or Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil, MSPO, which now apply for the companies involved in the production of palm oil in these countries. But yeah, in general, whilst there are some further initiatives, they do exist. Majority of the industry continues to be reliant on voluntary commitments, on voluntary activities, and they are not very supervised by any governance mechanism. I think this is especially true for the downstream segment. Actually, just 2 weeks ago, I read a public call from the RSPO to governments, including the European Union, to back such voluntary initiatives. And it has been argued that, voluntary initiatives can only do as much, and without the backing from governments, without some sort of more regulated action, it might be a little bit difficult to tip the scale for deforestation-free supply chains in the palm oil industry.
Certainly. I think many of the groups campaigning for change in sustainable palm oil would like to see those voluntary initiatives become mandatory. But I'm also aware that there are, in a number of countries, campaigns that regard investor divestment from palm oil. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, Dominica, on campaigns for divestment and whether this is a legitimate way of dealing with palm oil.
Yeah, it is a very, very good question, very topical as well. It is true that boycotting palm oil by consumers and also divesting from palm oil companies amid public criticism by investors has been sort of a thing in the past couple of years. And I think that the cases mentioned before by Dennis, especially the endangered orangutans, have really, really brought a lot of attention to the public eye, and rightly so, I think. It was really needed. However, what I think is really worth mentioning is that palm oil in itself as a crop is not really a problem. It is the way that it has been cultivated, especially by some more greedy players in the industry. Relatively, it may be actually quite a sustainable crop compared to some other oil crops. As we said in the very beginning, palm oil is an extremely productive crop. It is also very land efficient. So in fact, relatively, it can be quite sustainable compared to other oil crops. It often needs fewer pesticides and chemical fertilizers. And let's not forget that a lot of people depend on the palm oil industry. And it does not only include big corporations like we tend to think about it. In Indonesia and Malaysia, 4.5 million people rely on the palm oil industry for their livelihoods. So if consumers now boycott palm oil or investors divest from it in a larger scale, these small-scale farmers or plantation workers could really suffer a lot from such a situation. And I don't seem to be alone in this opinion. I think this slowly becomes a consensus amongst the players in the sustainable palm oil industry. Worth mentioning here may be the WWF statement aimed specifically at financial institutions that was called Don't Divest Away Our Forests, in which basically the organization argued a similar point. And let's face it, palm oil is not going anywhere. It is everywhere, as I said in the beginning. We cannot really realistically assume that we can just get rid of it now. So I think what we should try to do instead is to make sure that responsible practices become a norm in this industry, that deforestation no longer takes place, that peatlands are not developed, and that human rights are well respected. I think we need to increase or create the demand for sustainable palm oil simply. Consumers can do in this regards, well, you can just read up on your favorite company's palm oil policy, just see what they have out there. If they don't have anything, maybe then you try to contact them or boycott the company. You may also try to use applications that are now available for smartphones that may be helpful when it comes to searching for this sort of information. And then investors have also quite a big role in here. They may incorporate palm oil policy in their portfolios. They may join the PRI Investor Working Group on Sustainable Palm Oil or similar initiatives. There's really quite a lot of things that you can do nowadays.
Thank you, Dominika. Dennis, perhaps you can continue on with this point of what are some of the considerations that investors can make in how to manage the ESG risks in palm oil.
Yeah, certainly. I think for investors, a major thing is figuring out their exposure to palm oil in their portfolios. And a few ways of doing this is to analyze the sector and industry of the companies in their portfolio. Ones to keep an eye out on are the consumer packaged goods, the food and beverage industry, agriculture, commodity traders. Some specific products and services to keep in mind are some high-risk goods like processed foods, cleaning products, cosmetics, toiletries like soap and shampoo, and chocolate. And also to keep an eye on the countries that certain companies are operating in. For the palm oil industry, it's mostly going to be Malaysia and Indonesia, but there are also a few other countries in Africa, such as Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ghana, and in Central and South America, like Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, and Brazil, which have also growing palm oil industries that should be observation. Finally, an investor can do its due diligence and ask companies if they have NDPE policies, or if they are members of the RSPO, or if they require their supply chains to adhere to those policies and the certifications to make sure that palm oil is addressed in their portfolios.
So what are some tools that are available through ISS ESG that could build on some of that due diligence that might help investors address these issues? Dominika, maybe you could speak to us a little bit about how those tools work.
Yeah, sure. I can start with what my team offers. There is Sector-Based screen for the palm oil industry. It is relatively new, and it will basically help you identify and assess the involvement of companies in the palm oil industry across the risk sectors. So we don't look at controversies themselves yet. We look at the business that they are involved in. And our coverage is basically across the production chain, from oil palm plantations through refineries and fractionation plants, trading of oil palm and other on its derivatives, all the way down to the manufacturing of finished consumer goods such as food and personal care products. And for all these different stages of palm oil production, we include a revenue assessment, allowing you to identify companies that are more heavily involved in the industry revenue-wise. We also look at whether all of these companies have some sort of public policy on the matter, and also if they have a commitment to best practices, the commitment to NDPE. Further, when it comes to certification, we do look at all of those companies, whether or not they have RSPO certification. For more granular data, we also check if it is disclosed what percentage of the company's product is certified and in what model of the supply chain. We also look at some other certifications for the more curious investors. And basically, this is quite a lot of information already, and investors can filter this info as they see fit and play with it a little bit depending on their own approach, their revenue thresholds, the level of involvement they want to focus on, etc. I think it may be a very, very useful tool for investors to address these issues.
Thank you, Dominika. Dennis, could you speak about the tools available via the ISS ESG controversies research?
Yeah, so on the controversies and global norms side, we are definitely keeping track of palm oil related controversies globally. For example, in our database right now, we have about 30 publicly listed growers / producers that have controversies in the palm oil industry. From those 30 companies, there are 96 palm oil controversies associated with them. Of that 96 controversies that we have, about half of them are in the environmental topic area, 36% are in the human rights area, and 16% are in labor rights. So we can see even from our database that the majority of the controversies are in the environmental topic area. And I'd say almost all of them are issues with deforestation and biodiversity loss. So with all of this analysis, clients can really dig into the controversies that companies in their portfolios may be involved in and learn about those controversies and see if that might affect the company's reputation, their financial performance, and decide what they can do afterwards.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm also curious to know what you might expect to see unfolding for palm oil under COVID-19 restrictions. I'm aware that it's probably too soon to tell, but it would be great if either of you had any thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure, I can jump in on that. The more immediate effect is similar to other industries, basically slowed down by this crisis. The palm oil industry faces lower demand, hampered production, difficulties with transport. All these issues may be a challenge. As you said, it is maybe a little bit too early to say what exactly this will end up with in the end. It is likely to come back to normal. We will see whether this will have any economical impact, sort of. In the longer term, however, I think what could suffer is the effort towards sustainable palm oil that we've been talking about during the podcast. Especially smallholder farmers, for example, don't necessarily have such a great access to healthcare. So I'm afraid that if them or if maybe someone for their families gets sick, they may suffer economically quite a lot. And if they suffer economically, they may be less likely to join the effort because they simply would not afford to care about the sustainability of their product. And I think it applies more generally to all companies. Lower profit means that sustainability may be a little bit less prioritized. Not all actors are pessimistic regarding this aspect, but I think it is possible that while actors that already are committed to ethical sourcing will not really change their strategies, they will continue on their good work. There may be less new joiners now after the crisis, especially small scale, but we will see what happens later. And well, of course, in situations like the corona crisis, issues such as human rights abuses become a concern. So we have seen already some reported cases of safety of workers being compromised, but also companies taking advantage of the focus on the pandemic to kind of have it their way in land disputes and so on. Hopefully this will not be too more of a negative impact though.
Thank you, Dominika. Yes, I think it certainly is an area that we will all be paying close attention to as COVID unfolds. So I would like to thank you both, Dennis and Dominika, for your time today and for sharing your expertise and your insights. Clearly, palm oil is an industry that will require ongoing vigilance from investors, and I hope that our listeners could take something away from our conversation today.
Thank you. It was great to speak to you.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Nithya, Dominika, and Dennis for participating in this deep dive into the palm oil industry. For questions on this episode's topic, feel free to reach out to our experts by email at podcast@iss-esg.com. Stay in the know on the latest with ISS ESG by following us on LinkedIn and Twitter at ISS ESG. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to tune in next time to ISS ESG Foreword.